Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about Megan Rapinoe and the U.S. women's national team, because as you know, the Women's World Cup was on recently, and in the days leading up to their defeat, a lot of Americans found themselves in the sad and strange situation of almost rooting against their team, and in the days following their loss, a lot of Americans found themselves almost vaunting over or celebrating at the loss of their team, which, yeah, sad and strange. I suppose that's the best way to describe it. But I think that we can shed some light on the frustrations and on the reactions so as to, better appreciate what's at stake, and in the process to maybe heal and grow, grow beyond some of those frustrations and reactions so that we can be better engaged in addressing the root issues and better reconciled to the will of God at work within it. So here we go. Okay, so as you saw, there was some serious schadenfreude going on the internet. Schadenfreude, for those who don't know, is a pleasure derived from another person's misery or misfortune. So a lot of people were just celebrating the fact or vaunting over the fact that the U.S. women had lost, and specifically that Megan Rapinoe had lost, which is kind of unsettling because, it's just a strange position to occupy. And I fear that a lot of the commentary that has been proposed on this particular issue misses the point because it doesn't get to the heart of the matter, right? So it doesn't get to like what we as Christians or as Catholics know to be at stake. So I just want to talk about the main issues that a lot of people found themselves reacting to, and then how we ourselves can better engage them. So there's like the gay stuff, the pay gap stuff, and then the anti-American sentiment stuff. Let's take them each in turn. First, so the gay stuff. Megan Rapinoe, as you know, is lesbian. She's married to Sue Bird. She has been a very vocal and visible advocate for LGBTQ plus rights. And this is part of the overall kind of tendency of the last 10 years whereby that movement has become just more aggressive, more vocal and visible in general in advancing its particular advocacy. And the U.S. women's national team has been, like one of the places in which this whole debate has not so much been, on offer for exchange as a place where the debate has kind of been settled in favor of the LGBTQ plus movement. So you might remember like 4 years ago, there was one woman on the team, a committed Christian. I think her name is Jaylene Hinkle. She decided to sit out an exhibition game because their uniform, their kit was all pridey. And she didn't say the reasons for which. She said personal reasons. A lot of people suspected that it was because of the pridey stuff. And then she did say later why that was the case, why she stepped off. And yes, it was because of the pride kit. But she found great difficulty being readmitted to the team. And eventually she was sidelined from it, even though by many accounts she was quite an excellent defender. And the reasons cited were, football reasons, but many people suspected that it was because of locker room fit, because of team chemistry, because, everyone kind of has to be on board with this issue in order to be part of the team. And so I think a lot of people feel certain resentment against Megan Rapinoe, against the U.S. women's national team, insofar as a lot of the discourse in America surrounds freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of choice, and yet it doesn't actually work out that way, in keeping with, the last 10 years where we have seen the LGBTQ plus community become more aggressive and seemingly intolerant in advancing its particular agenda. So if you're not on board with, if you don't express sympathy for, then you are not only an enemy, right, but you're un-American and you're to be excluded from the discourse, which is scary. So I think that whenever, we have a kind of victory that we're inclined to celebrate, and there are good, like genuine victories to be celebrated, like Dobbs, for instance. But then this, like the defeat of the U.S. women's national team, is that a genuine victory, or are we just grasping at any stick with which to beat the thing that we fear is coming for us, and fear is coming for the most impressionable, the most vulnerable in our society? Here, I think it's an occasion to recognize the fact that our fight is not with flesh and blood. It's in the evil one's best interest to convince us that our fight is with flesh and blood, to constantly pose our struggle in terms of us versus them. And there are us versus them elements, like there are social and political dimensions to this struggle that we should be very clear about and not naive about. And yet, it's not with flesh and blood, it's with powers and principalities. So the sower of discord is always going to seek to set us against each other, when at the end of the day, the people whom we often find ourselves debating or contending with are potential members of the body of Christ. And that's not insignificant, right? So we shouldn't vaunt or we shouldn't engage in discourse, which is scandalous, which ultimately poses obstacles and makes it harder for those people to come into the fullness of the truth, right? To embrace the faith as it's proposed. So yeah, we need to convert hearts. We need to convert hearts, and that's largely going to unfold within a familial and ecclesial context, which is to say we need to pray, we need to fast, we need to make vigil. We need to offer our lives, in the service of those whom we can form, whom we can educate, to whom we can teach and preach, so that they might not be thrown for a loop, potentially bewildered or bemused by what they encounter in the world abroad, but drawn into the fullness of truth so that they can genuinely embrace it and then live their lives with some modicum of sanity. Okay, so that's the first, on the gay stuff. Second, on the pay gap stuff. Maybe you followed this debate, maybe you haven't, regardless, not too terribly important, but there's a difference between the compensation of men and women in a lot of sports, right? So that men are typically paid more and women are typically paid less, and that there's been some public outcry recently over this fact because it's seen as sexist. Now, the situation is somewhat peculiar in the case of the U.S. women's national team because soccer in the United States it's just a strange thing. So the women have typically been more successful, or they've historically been more successful than the men on the international stage, and the women have quite the following in the United States. So their success and their following is not reflected in the world abroad in the international situation. So this debate is very lively on U.S. soil. But in general, we can say that men's soccer is much more viewed and much more attended and thereby much more compensated. So they're given some proportion of the revenue, whether from ticket sales or from advertisements or from sponsorships or whatever else, and it amounts to more than the women are given, even though the women are given a higher proportion of those sales and advertisements and sponsorships, etc. But the women are still arguing for, strict equality, which is to say, X dollars on both sides of the fence. So I think that there's a kind of debate as to what degree advocacy should be present in sports. Okay, so sports are typically conceived to pertain to the entertainment industry, and typically entertainment is compensated in light of how much people find it to be entertaining or how entertaining people find it to be. So a lot of people tend to think like it shouldn't be a matter of advocacy. And you've seen this in other, US-based sports where people have had a very negative reaction to introducing advocacy to the sport. So you can think about the NFL and the NBA with like the whole BLM thing, 2020, 2021 especially. Or you can think about just recently in the MLB with like the Target and Bud Light boycotts. You had the one pitcher from the Toronto Blue Jays who kind of like liked a post, and then there was huge blowback and all of this back and forth, and eventually he was released. And so like you've seen it already with respect to race, with respect to gender. You're seeing it here, U.S. women's national team with respect to sex. So I think that a typical reaction is to say, like, just keep the advocacy out of the sport. Like, let me relax in my sport. Let me enjoy my sport. Let me just not have to deal with other issues in my sport because it's entertainment, right? It's leisure. It's something else. Okay. Now, I think that's a totally understandable reaction. But I think, again, it can mask a subtle misunderstanding. So for Megan Rapinoe, basically all of reality is political reality. So she wouldn't draw a distinction between like, this is entertainment, and then this is the social and political reality in which I should propose my advocacy. I think for her, it's just all a political reality. And here's the thing, for Christians, it's all a spiritual reality. So it all either contributes to or detracts from the attainment of our last end. And, in the case of Megan Rapinoe, I don't know whether there is a transcendent end. She professes to be a Christian. I don't make a judgment as to that, but I don't know whether there is a transcendent end to all of this, like what it looks like in the end times. But for us, there definitely is a transcendent end, which is to say an eschatological end, which is to say we're looking forward to heaven. And you can't like turn that off. You can't check out on that. That's something that has to always be present. And I think that if we're going to sport as a means of escape, or if we're going to sport as a way by which to live corporeally and not spiritually, then I think it will have misled us, right? And I think that you see in large part in American society a general tendency with respect to leisure to check out, right? To turn off and to evacuate any claim to whatever, further pursuits, which I think can be troubling. Because I think leisure ought ultimately to build us up in our contemplative lives. Leisure ought ultimately to be there to contribute to the glory of God and the salvation of souls. So it draws out from us a wholehearted dedication. So in the case of Megan Rapinoe, hers, it seems, is largely imminent, whereas ours should be transcendent. Okay, so I think that we should check ourselves and determine whether or not we've forgotten or we've grown weary of our transcendent end, and as a result of which we've maybe despaired of it, right? You've heard of the sin of sloth, where you look at the divine good and you see how exalted it is, and then you grow saddened at it because it doesn't seem possible for you. And so sometimes we seek to distract ourselves or disperse ourselves because we don't actually believe that it's possible to go to heaven. But here's the thing, it is possible to go to heaven, all right? And so, yeah, however you choose to practice sport or to consume sport, that can't be left out, all right? So, the pay gap. All right, last and finally, that's a repetition if ever there were one, the anti-patriotism. And I think this was the big thing in the more recent kind of blow up, dust up, whatever up. And I think the reason for which it's super frustrating is because it's largely blind to the facts of the matter. Okay, so when you can criticize your country, that signifies that your country is probably pretty good in terms of social and political liberties because you have the freedom to criticize your country and not be imprisoned. And certainly now in the United States, it seems like criticism is pretty high or is pretty thick or is pretty often. And there's different reasons for that. It seems like people on the left hate America because America hates their causes, or half of America hates their causes. And people on the right are frustrated with America because it seems like old and paralytic and otherwise decrepit and unable to address the issues which are rotting it to its very core. Or it seems like there's a governing class who is alienated from the working class, and that you largely, more and more, have two Americas. And certainly like the Oliver Anthony song, Richmond, North of Richmond, testifies to that kind of frustration. But I think that what we need to address at root is our kind of common sense of entitlement. And that's not to say that you're entitled, I'm entitled, or all God's children are entitled, but I think that there's some entitlement in the air. And here I think of the prodigal son who in the parable kind of cashes out on his inheritance and takes and does with it what he wills because of a certain like libertarian sense of spending or libertarian sense of license. And I think that that's just kind of in our social and political water, and we're all drinking from the same trough in that regard. And we're not thinking about common goods. We're not thinking about ways in which we can invest in the American experiment or perpetuate the American experiment. There's some pretty thick despair in the air. So it seems, gone are the days of JFK and ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I fear that we're losing something of our patriotism in the sense of piety, that is to say, the virtue which informs our just response to our country, which has given us our life in a certain sense. Chesterton has this disquisition sounds too dignified, but he has this reflection on whether we ought to be optimists or pessimists. And he says, at the end of the day, neither. We should be patriots, right? We should love the thing because it's ours. Because if we love the thing because it's ours, good things will follow in turn, but not because that's our goal. We don't love it in order that the good things come about. We love it, and we come to discover as if by accident that good things have come about. He cites the seaside resort, which at his time was a bit run down. And he said, Brighton's not going to be overhauled or it's not going to be renewed because somebody makes of it a personal project, right? Because somebody engages in that as a kind of experiment, or somebody, invests in it for reasons of urban planning. He said, it'll be renewed when people discover that they love it, right? When those native sons of Brighton come in defense of it, right? Or for its upbuilding. And I think that you can say something similar for America. We need to reflect on the fact that we love it as a kind of common good, nestled under the common good of the church, all nestled under the common good of God, so that we can recognize where we have come from and that to which we're destined, and then contribute in ways that are appropriate to the here and the now. So you just see kind of alarming signs across the board with fewer volunteers for the armed forces, fewer marriages, fewer children, and we're just acting like we're entitled to the goods of this country and that we can cash out with those goods of this country. When truth be told, we're not entitled to it. It's only something to which we can contribute, and in contributing to it, we discover that we enjoy its benefits or we enjoy its goods. So I think for Christians, this should be an occasion of reflection, namely that we aren't entitled to heaven. All right, while we can speak of merit, that merit is itself God's gift, and that we live in this kind of ambiance of gratuity, and that we should be, grateful for, that we should reflect back a certain grace vis-a-vis those things that have been poured out upon us or bestowed so richly upon us, such that we can attain to that end, right? in God, in country, in parents and family, in civil society, and whatever else. Okay? So, yeah, when it comes to then like the Megan Rapinoe kind of U.S. women's national team experiencing some hope that they'd lose in the days before, experiencing some delight that they lost in the days after, I think that we're just frustrated, right? We're just frustrated with our current situation. We're saddened by our current situation. But I think the reasons for which are more complicated, and that we need to be honest about those reasons, and that we need to, kind of lean in and invest and commit in new ways, even if in small ways, modest ways, so that we can address the root causes and we can address the root problems. Yeah, and in the end, I think that we ultimately have to orient our gaze back to what really is, to God at the heart of the reality from whom reality radiates, and to engage with it. So you'll hear people say that we're going to be saved by beauty. You'll hear other people say we're going to be saved by goodness. You'll hear other people say we're going to be saved by truth. I think that we can say even more fundamentally we're going to be saved, that we are going to be saved by being, right? God, whose very nature is to be, who identifies himself in Exodus 3 as I am who am, because we want what's real. We want to engage with what's real. We're going to be saved by what's real. And this is in part the reason for which I always return in these videos to doctrinal topics. A lot of people find the cultural or political commentary a little more satisfying or clickbaity, regardless. Keep going, Father Gregory. But when I talk about like God and creation and the moral life and Christ and the church and the sacraments, ultimately those are the things that are going to save us. And we want to be put in touch with those things that are going to save us, because we need to engage with those things if we stand to be saved. Because ultimately we need God. We need God. So I hope that, these reflections are somewhat helpful in orienting the discourse, right? Sorting out some principles and some arguments whereby we ourselves can take a next step. We ourselves can journey further up and further into God's plan for us, even in the midst of a culture which is so super confused. Because at the end of the day, amen, hallelujah, we need God. Okay, boom. That is what I wanted to share. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel. This is Pints with Aquinas. Push the bell and get email updates when other things come out from the channel. Also, if you haven't yet, check out Godsplaining, which is a podcast to which I contribute with 4 other Dominican friars, which has cool things available every Thursday and even more frequently at various junctures, whereby, we kind of engage cultural issues like this, but with that strong contemplative and doctrinal backbone so as to orient us in what is real. We also have a retreat coming up for Godsplaining. It's a young adults retreat, so young adults age 21 through 33 at Malvern Retreat House in Malvern, Pennsylvania. That's November 3rd through 5th, and you can find details and apply at godsplaining.org. Again, November 3rd through 5th, Malvern, Pennsylvania, young adults 21 through 33, and the theme of the retreat is the book Truth and Tolerance by Pope Benedict XVI. So it's going to be about, the one true God, basically, and then relativism and various world religions and traditions. And then finally, we've got this Dominican Rosary pilgrimage coming up on September 30th in Washington, D.C. at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. I'm going to be giving 2 talks or 2 conferences. We're going to have time for adoration and confessions and a lunch break, a fervorino by the promoter of the Rosary for the Dominican Order, Father Lawrence Liu, the recitation of the Rosary, and a vigil mass, all at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. So you can find all those details at rosarypilgrimage.org. I think that's enough for today. Those are all my announcements. Okay, know my prayers for you. Please pray for me, and I'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.